Amy Miller stood at the front of room 103 of Lakeside Middle School. Her hands shook a little as she held her note cards. It was her turn for the family history project in Ms. Peters's 7th grade social studies class. All 24 students had to give a 5-minute talk about a family member they looked up to. Amy had picked her grandfather, Frank Miller. "My hero is my grandpa Frank," Amy began. Her voice was quiet at first but grew stronger as she talked. "He passed away 3 years ago when I was 9, but he told me many stories about when he was a soldier in Vietnam." Ms. Peters watched with narrow eyes from her desk. She was new to Lakeside this year. The students thought she was too strict. She always wanted facts and proof for everything. Amy showed a photo of an older man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "This is my grandpa Frank. He didn't like to talk about the war much, but he told me stories that no one else in my family got to hear." Amy's eyes lit up. He was a real hero. Once his whole group was trapped by enemy soldiers. Grandpa Frank snuck behind enemy lines and made a distraction that let all his friends escape. He got a special medal for it, but he said the mission was so secret that they couldn't tell anyone about it. Ms. Peters stood up suddenly. "That's enough, Amy." Her voice was sharp. Amy stopped talking. The whole class looked at Ms. Peters. "I'm sorry, but I cannot let this continue." Ms. Peters walked to the front of the room. "Part of this assignment was to research your facts. I have personally studied the service records of local veterans for a book I'm writing. There was no Frank Miller who did anything like what you're describing." Amy's face turned red. "But he did. He told me about it." "Many veterans tell tall tales to impress their grandchildren," Ms. Peters said to the class. "But in this classroom we deal with historical facts, not made-up stories." "I'm not lying," Amy said, her voice getting louder. "My grandpa wouldn't lie to me. Your grandfather may have served in some capacity, but he certainly did not perform heroic acts that earned him secret medals." Ms. Peters crossed her arms. "Making up stories about war heroism is very disrespectful to real heroes." Tears formed in Amy's eyes. "He was a real hero. He saved people. The government just kept it secret." The other kids started to whisper to each other. Some pulled out their phones under their desks. "Young lady," Ms. Peters said, her face turning red, "I will not have you spreading falsehoods in my classroom about military service. It's stolen valor, and it's shameful." "It's not."
"False," Amy yelled. "My grandpa was a hero."
What happened next shocked everyone. Ms. Peters's hand moved quickly across Amy's face with a loud slap. The whole class gasped. Amy's head jerked to the side, and her note cards scattered across the floor. "How dare you talk back and continue this lie?" Ms. Peters shouted. For a moment, the room was completely quiet. Then Amy burst into tears. She ran out of the classroom, leaving her backpack and the photo of her grandfather behind. The class erupted. Some students shouted at Ms. Peters, others ran after Amy. A few were busy tapping on their phones, their eyes wide. "Settle down," Ms. Peters yelled, but no one listened. She seemed to realize what she had done. Her angry face changed to one of shock. Joey Martinez, who sat in the back row, stood up. "I'm getting Principal Simmons." He walked out before Ms. Peters could stop him. 10 minutes later, Principal Simmons arrived with Joey. By then, half the class had left to find Amy or tell other teachers what happened. Ms. Peters sat at her desk, her face pale. "Ms. Peters, I need to speak with you immediately," Principal Simmons said in a serious voice. "The rest of you, class is dismissed. Go to the library until your next period." As the students filed out, they saw Amy sitting in the office with the school nurse. Her cheek was still red. She clutched the photo of her grandfather, which someone had brought to her. By lunchtime, everyone in school knew what had happened. Many students had sent the videos they took to their parents. Amy's parents arrived at school looking very upset. Amy's mother, Susan Miller, hugged her daughter tightly in the principal's office. "Are you okay, sweetie? I can't believe a teacher would do this." Amy's father, John Miller, paced around angrily. "Where is this teacher? I want her fired immediately." Principal Simmons tried to calm them down. "Ms. Peters has been suspended, pending a full investigation. We take this very seriously. There is no excuse for a teacher to strike a student. regardless of the circumstances. My daughter was simply sharing stories her grandfather told her, Susan said. Even if Ms. Peters doubted them, there was no reason to humiliate Amy, let alone hit her. I know my dad wasn't a liar, Amy said quietly. Grandpa Frank told me those stories when I would visit him in the hospital. He made me promise not to tell anyone except for a school project someday. He said some things had to stay secret because of his job, but that someday I could be proud of him openly. John sat down next to his daughter. Your grandpa was a good man, Amy. He didn't talk much about his time in the service, even to your mom. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a hero. Ms. Peters said I was making it all up. Amy wiped her eyes. She said there's no record of Grandpa doing anything special in the war. Susan looked troubled. Dad was always so private about his military service. I know he was in Vietnam, but he never told me details. He would change the subject whenever I asked. By the end of the school day, videos of the incident had spread online. Local news stations called the school for comments. Ms. Peters released a short statement through her union representative, saying she regretted the physical contact, but stood by her duty to historical accuracy. That evening, as Amy sat at the dinner table pushing food around her plate, she looked up at her parents. I'm not going back to school. Everyone will think Grandpa was a fake hero. Susan put her hand on Amy's. We'll figure this out, honey. If your grandpa told you those stories, there must be some truth to them. We just need to find it. John nodded. I'm going to look through your grandpa's old things in the attic this weekend. Maybe there's something there that can help us understand. What none of them knew was that the viral video of Amy being slapped had just been seen by someone who knew exactly what Frank Miller had done in Vietnam. Someone who was about to change everything with a surprise visit to their small town. By the next morning, the video of Ms. Peters slapping Amy had spread far beyond Lakeside. News vans parked outside the school. Reporters tried to talk to students as they arrived. Principal Simmons sent a message to all parents saying that classes would continue normally and asking for privacy. Amy stayed home. She sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, watching as her story appeared on the morning news. A teacher at Lakeside Middle School has been suspended after slapping a student who claimed her grandfather was a war hero, said the news lady. The incident has sparked debate about classroom discipline and the verification of family military histories. Susan turned off the TV. You don't need to watch that, honey. Everyone thinks Grandpa was a fake, Amy said quietly. John came downstairs with a dusty box. I found some of your grandpa's things in the attic. He set the box on the coffee table. Maybe there's something in here that can help. They opened the box together. Inside were old photos, some medals that looked ordinary, and papers from Frank Miller's time in the Army. One paper said he worked in administrative support in Vietnam. Administrative support? Susan looked confused. Dad never mentioned being in an office. I always assumed he was in combat. John read through more papers. According to these records, he was a clerk. He processed paperwork for soldiers going home. He looked at Amy. That doesn't match the stories he told you. He wasn't lying, Amy insisted. He told me he couldn't tell most people what he really did. The phone rang. It was Principal Simmons calling Susan. After a short talk, Susan hung up and sighed. The school board is meeting tonight to discuss what happened. They want us to be there, she told John and Amy. Ms. Peters will be there too. She's still claiming she was right about Grandpa Frank's service record, even though she admits she shouldn't have slapped you. I don't want to see her, Amy said. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, John assured her. But it might be good for you to hear what the school plans to do about this. That evening, the school gym was packed with parents, teachers, and community members. Rows of chairs faced a long table where the school board members sat. Principal Simmons stood at a podium explaining what had happened. While we continue our investigation, we want to be clear that physical discipline is never acceptable in our school, he said firmly. The Millers sat in the front row. Amy kept her head down as people looked at her. Ms. Peters sat across the room with a man in a suit who was probably her lawyer. When Principal Simmons finished speaking, the head of the school board, Mrs. Garcia, asked if anyone wanted to share their thoughts. Many parents stood up to say that Ms. Peters should be fired. A few older people suggested that questioning a veteran's family was disrespectful. Then Ms. Peters was invited to speak. She walked to the podium, looking nervous but determined. "I want to apologize for losing my temper and striking Amy," she began. "That was wrong, and I am truly sorry." She paused, then continued. "However, I stand by my academic concerns. As a historian who has studied local veterans, I know there is no record of Frank Miller performing heroic actions in Vietnam. His service record clearly states he was in administrative support." People in the crowd started to talk loudly. Some agreed with Ms. Peters, others booed. "Spreading false stories about military service is called stolen valor," Ms. Peters continued. "It dishonors real heroes. I believe Amy's grandfather may have exaggerated his role to impress her. While my reaction was inappropriate, I was trying to uphold historical truth." John stood up angrily. "You're calling my father-in-law a liar. You have no right, Ms." Peters looked at him calmly. "I've checked all public military records, Mr. Miller. If you have proof of your father-in-law's heroism, please share it." The room grew tense. Susan squeezed Amy's hand. They had found nothing in Frank's belongings that proved the stories he told Amy. Just then the gym doors opened. Everyone turned to look. A man with a beard walked in. He wore jeans, boots, and a black button-up shirt. Even though he was older, he moved with strength and purpose. People began to whisper excitedly. "That's Chuck Norris," someone said loudly. The famous actor and martial arts expert walked down the center aisle as if this was completely normal. People pulled out their phones to take pictures. The school board members looked shocked. Chuck Norris nodded politely to the crowd and approached the podium. Mrs. Garcia, who seemed too surprised to speak, moved aside to let him talk. "Good evening," Chuck Norris said in his calm, strong voice. "I apologize for interrupting, but I saw a video online about a young girl being punished for sharing stories about her grandfather, Frank Miller." He looked directly at Amy. "I flew in from Texas because I needed to set the record straight." The room went completely silent. Everyone stared as Chuck Norris pulled a folder from under his arm. "I knew Frank Miller," he continued. "Not the administrative clerk from the public records, but the real Frank Miller, the one his granddaughter described." Ms. Peters stood up. "Mr. Norris, with all due respect, military records are clear." Chuck Norris gave her a look that made her sit back down. "Not all military records are public, ma'am." He opened the folder. "Yesterday I made some calls to people who owe me favors. I got special permission to reveal certain facts about operations that have been classified for decades." He held up an old photograph. It showed a group of tough-looking men in military gear. In the front row stood a younger Chuck Norris next to a man who looked like the grandfather in Amy's photo. "This is Frank Miller," Chuck said, pointing to the man. "We served together in a special unit that officially didn't exist. On paper, we all had boring jobs like clerk, cook, or mechanic. That's how the government kept our real work secret." Amy sat up straight. Tears filled her eyes, but she was smiling. Chuck Norris looked at the school board. "Frank Miller was one of the bravest men I ever knew. The story his granddaughter told about him creating a distraction to save his unit? That happened in May 1971. I was there. He saved my life and the lives of 14 others that day." Ms. Peters looked stunned. The crowd began to murmur in amazement. "I'm not allowed to share all the details," Chuck continued, "but I can confirm that Frank Miller was exactly the hero his granddaughter believes he was. And tomorrow I'd like to tell Amy some stories about her grandfather that she hasn't heard yet. Stories I'm now permitted to share." He turned to look directly at Ms. Peters. "Sometimes, ma'am, history is more complicated than what shows up in the public record." The school gym buzzed with excitement after Chuck Norris finished speaking. People stood up trying to get a better look at the famous actor. School board members whispered to each other, clearly unsure what to do next. Mrs. Garcia finally tapped the microphone. "In light of this unexpected information, I think we should take a short break. We'll continue the meeting in 15 minutes." As people moved around, Chuck Norris walked directly to Amy and her parents. He extended his hand to John and Susan. "I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances," he said. Frank was a good friend. Susan looked shocked. "My father never mentioned knowing you." "He couldn't," Chuck explained. "Our work was classified. Most of the men I served with took those secrets to their graves." Amy stared up at Chuck Norris with wide eyes. "You really knew my grandpa?" Chuck smiled down at her. "I sure did. And he was exactly the hero you described." He knelt down to her level. "Frank saved my life more than once. He never bragged about it, though. That wasn't his way." Across the room, Ms. Peters sat alone. Her lawyer was on the phone, and most people were avoiding her. She kept looking at the photograph Chuck had shown, her face pale. After the break, everyone returned to their seats. Mrs. Garcia called the meeting back to order. "Mr. Norris, would you be willing to share more about Frank Miller's service to the extent you're permitted?" Chuck Norris returned to the podium. He placed several documents on the small table beside it. "Yesterday, I contacted some people at the Pentagon," he began. "I explained the situation and asked for permission to declassify certain information about operations from 50 years ago. They agreed, but only for specific details." He held up an official-looking paper with some parts blacked out. "This is a partially declassified mission report from Operation Shadowfall, dated May 18, 1971. It confirms that Sergeant Frank Miller created a diversion that allowed his surrounded unit to escape an enemy ambush." People in the audience leaned forward, trying to see. "Frank volunteered to stay behind and set off explosives at the far side of the camp while we evacuated our wounded," Chuck continued. "He was supposed to die that day. No one expected him to make it out. But 3 days later, he walked into our base covered in mud with information about enemy movements that saved hundreds of American lives." Amy wiped tears from her eyes. Her mother put an arm around her shoulders. "For his actions, Frank received a Silver Star," Chuck said. "But because our unit officially didn't exist, the medal and the citation were never made public." He pulled out a small box and opened it, revealing a silver star hanging from a ribbon. "The government has allowed me to present this to Frank's family today." He walked over and handed the box to Amy. She touched the metal gently as if it might break. "This belongs to you now," Chuck told her. "Your grandfather wanted you to know the truth someday." Ms. Peters stood up suddenly. "May I speak?" she asked in a shaky voice. Mrs. Garcia nodded reluctantly. Ms. Peters walked slowly to the front of the room. She looked at Chuck Norris, then at Amy, then at the crowd. "I owe everyone an apology," she said. "Especially Amy." She took a deep breath. "I prided myself on thorough research and historical accuracy. I believed I knew the full story about local veterans. I was wrong." She turned to face Amy directly. "I was wrong about your grandfather, and I was wrong to treat you the way I did. There is no excuse for my behavior." The room was silent as Ms. Peters continued. "I forgot that history isn't just what's written in public records. I forgot that some stories have to wait to be told." She looked down at her hands. "I am deeply sorry for hurting you and for dishonoring your grandfather's memory." Amy didn't say anything, but she gave a small nod. Principal Simmons stood up. "Thank you for your apology, Ms. Peters. The board will still need to decide on appropriate consequences for your actions." Ms. Peters nodded. "I understand. Regardless of the board's decision, I plan to resign my position. My actions were unacceptable for a teacher." After she returned to her seat, Mrs. Garcia addressed Chuck Norris again. "Sir, we appreciate you coming all this way to set the record straight. Is there anything else you'd like to share?" "Just one thing," Chuck replied. "Frank Miller was part of a unit that carried out special operations. Our work remained classified because revealing it could have endangered ongoing missions and operatives. Many brave men and women served their country in ways that will never be publicly recognized." He looked around the room. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose stories are never told. After the meeting ended, reporters crowded around Chuck Norris, Amy, and her family. The next day, their story would be in newspapers across the country. But for now, Chuck suggested they go somewhere quiet to talk. They went to a small diner down the street from the school. The owner recognized Chuck Norris immediately and gave them a private room in the back. Once they were seated with cups of hot chocolate, Amy finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "How did you know about me and what happened at school?" Chuck smiled. "I saw the video online yesterday. Someone had shared it with the caption, 'Girl slapped for lying about her grandfather being a war hero.' As soon as I saw your grandfather's photo in the background, I recognized Frank." "Did you stay in touch with him after the war?" Susan asked. Chuck shook his head. "We couldn't. Our unit was disbanded, and we were all sent to different places with strict orders never to contact each other or talk about what we did." "Then how did you know it was him in the photo?" John asked. "Some faces you never forget," Chuck said simply. "Frank had a scar above his right eyebrow from a mission in Laos. I saw it in the photo." Amy touched her own eyebrow. "Grandpa told me he got that scar falling off a bike." "That was his cover story," Chuck explained. "He had a different one for most of his injuries." "He told me some of what they did," Amy said, "but he made me promise not to tell anyone except for a school project someday." Chuck nodded. Frank always followed rules, but he also believed in passing down the truth when the time was right. He must have known his time was coming, and he wanted you to know who he really was. "Will you tell us more about him?" Amy asked. "About what he really did?" Chuck looked at his watch. "It's getting late and you've had a long day, but if your parents agree, I can come by tomorrow and share some stories that have just been cleared for me to tell." Amy looked at her parents hopefully. "We'd be honored," Susan said. "My father never shared these stories with me. I'd like to know who he really was." Chuck Norris smiled. "Then I'll see you tomorrow. Frank Miller was one of the best men I ever knew. It's about time his family learned the truth about the hero he was." The next morning, news vans still lined the street outside the Miller home. Reporters tried to get pictures through the windows. The phone rang constantly until John unplugged it. "This is crazy," Susan said, peeking through the curtains. "I never expected this much attention." Amy sat at the kitchen table looking at her grandfather's silver star. The metal seemed to catch the light in a special way. She wondered how many people knew what her grandfather had really done to earn it. At exactly 10 o'clock, a black SUV pulled into their driveway. Two serious-looking men in suits got out first, checked the area, and then opened the door for Chuck Norris. The reporters rushed forward, shouting questions and taking pictures. Chuck ignored them as he walked to the front door. John let him in quickly and closed the door behind him. "Sorry about the circus out there," Chuck said, taking off his jacket. "I brought something that might help." He handed John a thick folder. "The government gave me permission to share these documents with your family. Some parts are still blacked out, but they tell most of Frank's story." They gathered in the living room. Amy sat close to Chuck on the couch as he opened the folder. "Your grandfather joined the Army in 1968, Chuck began. "He was selected for special training because of his skills. Frank could speak Vietnamese and Lao. He was also very good at moving silently in the jungle and remembering details." "Dad knew other languages?" Susan looked surprised. "He never mentioned that. He wasn't allowed to," Chuck explained. "Frank was part of a small team that gathered information behind enemy lines. On paper, we were simple administrative workers. In reality, we went where regular soldiers couldn't go." He showed them a map, with certain areas circled in red. "These were places where Frank led missions. He was one of our best team leaders." Amy looked at a black and white photo of young men standing by a helicopter. Her grandfather stood in the middle, looking serious, but proud in his uniform. "Frank had a special talent for getting people to trust him," Chuck continued. "He could walk into a village where Americans weren't welcome and leave with friends and information. He saved more lives by preventing battles than most soldiers did by fighting in them." John flipped through some papers with official stamps. "It says here he received training from something called MAC-VSOG. What is that?" "Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group," Chuck answered. "It was a special forces unit that carried out covert operations. Most of what we did wasn't recorded in normal military reports." He turned to Amy. "The story you told in class about your grandfather creating a distraction to save his unit, was from May 1971. We were on a mission to find American prisoners when we were surrounded by enemy forces. We had wounded men who couldn't move fast. Frank volunteered to stay behind. Chuck's voice grew quiet. He set explosives on the far side of our position and fired his weapon to make it sound like we were all there. That gave the rest of us time to escape with the wounded. We thought he'd been captured or killed. But he wasn't, Amy said confidently. Chuck smiled. No, he wasn't. 3 days later, he walked into our camp. His uniform was torn and he was covered in mud and scratches. But he was alive, and he had a map showing enemy positions that helped save hundreds of American soldiers from walking into a trap. Susan wiped tears from her eyes. Why didn't he ever tell us any of this? He took an oath of secrecy, Chuck explained. Many operations remained classified long after the war ended. Some still are. Frank was a man who kept his promises, even when it meant no one would know what he'd done. Except he told Amy, John pointed out. Chuck nodded. From what you've said, he was careful about what he shared. He didn't give dates, locations, or mission details, just enough so that his granddaughter would know he'd served with honor. They spent the next hour looking through papers and photos. Chuck explained what he could about their missions, though many details were still classified. Now I understand why Dad had nightmares, Susan said softly. Mom used to say he'd wake up in a cold sweat, but he would never talk about it. Many of us did, Chuck admitted. What we saw and did stayed with us. Amy had been quiet for a while, studying each photo carefully. Finally, she looked up at Chuck. Did Grandpa ever save your life directly? Chuck smiled. More than once. The first time was during a mission in a place I'm still not allowed to name. I stepped on a booby trap, a hidden explosive. Frank saw what was happening and pushed me aside. The blast caught him in the leg instead of hitting me directly. He rolled up his pants leg to show a faded scar. I got this from flying debris. Your grandfather got much worse, but he never complained. He limped for the next 40 miles as we made our way back to friendly territory. Is that why he walked with a cane sometimes? Amy asked. Probably. Chuck nodded. Old wounds have a way of acting up as you get older. There was a knock at the door. John went to answer it and came back with Principal Simmons. I'm sorry to interrupt, the principal said, looking nervously at Chuck Norris. But the school board has made some decisions after last night's meeting, and I wanted to tell you in person. He sat down when Susan offered him a chair. First, Ms. Peters has officially resigned. She'll be leaving Lakeside immediately. That's good, John said firmly. Second, Principal Simmons continued, the board would like to create a special display in our school honoring local veterans, including Frank Miller. With your permission, we'd like to include his photo and story. Susan smiled. I think Dad would have liked that. And third, the principal said, looking at Amy, we'd like to invite Chuck Norris to speak at a special assembly about military service and classified operations, if he's willing. Chuck looked thoughtful. I'd need to get approval for what I could share, but I'd be happy to do it. Amy suddenly had an idea. Could the assembly be named after Grandpa? The Frank Miller Memorial Assembly? Principal Simmons nodded. I think that's an excellent suggestion. Outside, the reporters were still waiting, hoping for a statement. But inside the Miller home, Amy felt at peace for the first time since the classroom incident. Her grandfather had been a real hero after all, and now everyone would know it. 2 weeks later, Lakeside Middle School was transformed. The main hallway now featured a glass display case filled with photos and stories of local veterans. Frank Miller's picture held the center spot, with his Silver Star medal on a small velvet cushion below it. A short description told visitors about his bravery during classified missions in Vietnam. Students and parents gathered in the gym for the first Frank Miller Memorial Assembly. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls. News crews set up cameras at the back of the room. Amy sat in the front row with her parents. She wore a blue dress and held a small photo of her grandfather in her hands. She felt nervous but proud. Principal Simmons walked to the podium. Welcome, everyone. Today is a special day for our school and our community. 2 weeks ago, we learned an important lesson about history. that sometimes the truth is hidden from public view, not because it isn't real, but because it must be protected. He gestured to the side of the stage. We are honored to have a special guest with us today. Please welcome Mr. Chuck Norris. The crowd cheered as Chuck walked onto the stage. He wore a suit and looked much more formal than the last time Amy had seen him. He shook hands with Principal Simmons and stepped up to the microphone. Thank you for inviting me, he began. I'm here today because of a brave young girl who stood up for the truth about her grandfather. He looked at Amy and smiled. And I'm here because of Frank Miller, one of the finest soldiers I ever served with. For the next 30 minutes, Chuck told stories about bravery, sacrifice, and honor. He explained how some military missions remained secret for decades to protect national security. He shared what he could about Frank Miller's service, making sure everyone understood what a hero he had been. Frank never sought recognition, Chuck said near the end of his talk. He did his duty with quiet courage. When the war ended, he came home and built a life without ever telling most people what he had done for his country. That, too, was part of his service. He looked out at the crowd. There are many veterans like Frank among us. Their full stories may never be told, but they deserve our respect and gratitude. After Chuck finished speaking, Principal Simmons returned to the podium. We have one more special announcement today. He turned to where Ms. Peters sat at the edge of the crowd. Ms. Peters, would you please come up? The former teacher looked surprised. She slowly made her way to the stage, keeping her eyes down as people whispered. Ms. Peters has asked for a moment to speak, Principal Simmons explained. Then he stepped aside. Ms. Peters stood nervously at the microphone. I want to thank you for allowing me to be here today. As many of you know, I made a terrible mistake. I let my pride in historical accuracy blind me to the deeper truth. She looked at Amy. I heard a child who was simply sharing what she knew about her grandfather. She unfolded a piece of paper. I've spent the past 2 weeks reflecting on my actions and learning an important lesson. History isn't just what's written in books or official records. Sometimes the most important stories are passed down through families, protected from public view, but no less true. Ms. Peters looked up at the crowd. I'm starting a new chapter in my life. I've accepted a position with the Veterans History Project, recording the stories of veterans whose experiences might otherwise be lost. I want to help preserve the truth, not reject it when it doesn't match official records. She stepped away from the podium, and Principal Simmons returned. Thank you, Ms. Peters. Now we have a special presentation. He motioned for Amy to join him on stage. Amy walked up slowly, feeling everyone's eyes on her. Her heart beat fast. Amy Miller showed courage when she shared her grandfather's story. Principal Simmons said, Today we'd like to present her with the first Frank Miller Memorial Scholarship Award. This will be given yearly to a student who shows exceptional interest in military history and truth. He handed Amy a certificate in a frame. We hope this will help your education when you reach college age. Amy took the microphone, though she hadn't planned to speak. Thank you, she said quietly. Then she found her voice. My grandpa told me his stories because he trusted me. He knew I would believe him even when others might not. I'm happy everyone now knows he was a real hero. After the assembly, people lined up to look at the veterans' display. Amy stood nearby, answering questions about her grandfather. A group of older men in veteran caps came to shake her hand. We served in Vietnam too, one man said. Not in your grandfather's unit, but we know what those boys did. They saved a lot of lives. Later that day, the Miller family invited Chuck Norris to their home for dinner. The reporters had finally left and they could enjoy a quiet meal together. Susan had cooked Frank's favorite foods, pot roast and apple pie. As they sat around the table, Chuck raised his glass. To Frank Miller, a hero who never stopped serving even when he couldn't tell his own story. They all raised their glasses. Amy thought about how much had changed in just 2 weeks. Her grandfather's photo now hung in the school hallway. Students who had laughed at her now asked questions about her grandfather's medals. Even Ms. Peters had learned something important. After dinner, Chuck presented Amy with one more gift, a small wooden box with her grandfather's initials carved on top. Frank gave this to me before our last mission together, Chuck explained. He asked me to keep it safe. Inside is something he wanted his family to have someday. Amy opened the box carefully. Inside was a small compass with a dent on one side. That compass saved his life once, Chuck said. A bullet hit it instead of his heart. He said it always pointed him home when he was lost. Amy held the compass carefully. It still worked, the needle pointing steadily north. Your grandfather was my compass many times, Chuck told her. He always knew which way was right. Before Chuck left, he had one last piece of advice for Amy. Keep telling your grandfather's story. Some people won't believe it, but that doesn't make it less true. The best heroes are often the ones whose names aren't in history books. Amy nodded. She knew she would keep her promise. Her grandfather's story would live on, no longer secret, but still special, just like the hero he had been.